Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the historic City Opera House. I'm Jill Tousley with the National Writer Series, and on behalf of everybody from the National Writer Series, I want to welcome you to an evening in conversation with Daniel James Brown. The National Writer Series began in 2009 with an event on this very stage. This evening's event marks somewhat of a milestone for us. It is our 60th event. Yeah. Now, some of our events have featured more than one author, and all of our events have featured almost all of our events have featured a guest host. Well, many of those events were hosted by our very own Doug Stanton. The National Writer Series has featured guest hosts that are publishing professionals, published authors, and experts in their field. In all, we have featured almost 100 people on the National Writer Series stage. Thank you for that recognition, but I want to thank all of you because without people like you who come to these events, buy books, listen, and ask great questions, it simply would not have been possible. The National Writer Series is also possible because of our sustaining sponsor, the FIM Group, fee-only wealth managers located downtown. They have been a sustaining sponsor of the National Writer Series since we began in 2009. Thank you as well to our other major sponsors, Smith Hoey Rice Rogie, Dr. Gum and his associates at Traverse City I, Cherry Capital Airport, and our transportation sponsor, Cherry Capital Subaru Cadillac. Now, thank you. Now, in addition to being a sustaining sponsor, the FIM Group will donate 20% of all of the book sales this evening, as they do for all of our events, back to the National Writer Series. And our on-site bookseller, Horizon Books, will also do the same. And I also want to say, for those of you, I'm sure you're all aware, Horizon Books is now back open after having been closed for a week. So wonderful. Now, if you have been to our events in the past, you have no doubt heard me talk about our Front Street Writers Program and our National Writer Series Scholarship Program. I mention both of these programs at a lot of our events because they are truly what we are all about. The conversations that we have on this stage are not only meant to support book sales and to stimulate conversation about the writing arts, but the ticket sales from these events support programs that encourage and support younger generations pursuing higher education and those interested in writing and reading. Our Front Street Writers Program is a one-of-a-kind creative writing intensive for high school juniors and seniors. Every year we hire an MFA to serve as a writer in residence to instruct the students throughout the year. These students receive intensive instruction and can earn college credit for the course. They're provided with an opportunity to be published throughout the year through a variety of channels, both print and online. Their writing is showcased during 2 annual public readings that each attract 100 or more people. And they are often instructed by our very own visiting authors, whom, as you know, are some of the finest individuals writing today. Pretty amazing, right? But did I mention that this is a tuition-free program? So how is that possible? Well, with every time you purchase a ticket to one of our events, you are supporting the Front Street Writers Program. The tickets to our events start at $20, and with the exception of our annual fundraising event during Cherry Festival, the ticket prices generally do not go higher than $35. Not a bad price to pay for an evening's worth of second-to-none entertainment and to help people or help provide students from this area with an educational experience of a lifetime. Every year, we also recognize 3 students with scholarships that we award in writing in fiction, nonfiction, and poetry. This past April, we awarded 3 individuals with scholarships, and it brought our total amount of scholarship dollars that we've given out so far in excess of $33,000. So thank you, all of you, for supporting our events, whether you're making dollar contributions, buying tickets, or buying books at these events. Now, our guest host for this evening's event is Lucas Whitman. He arrived in Traverse City, I'm not kidding, maybe just a few minutes ago, after his morning flight out of New York was canceled and he had to make a connecting flight in Chicago, which he arrived for on time, but was also delayed a couple of hours. So we are very glad that he is here with us tonight. He has worked in publishing for W. Norton and Company before he became the literary editor and senior articles editor at Newsweek and the Daily Beast, and he is currently the executive editor and associate publisher for the newly launched book and multimedia publisher Reagan Arts. Daniel James Brown arrived in Traverse City last night, but he also experienced a lengthy delay at the same airport, O'Hare. But since arriving last night, he has been getting to know Traverse City on a very personal level. Doug introduced him last night to a student returning from college for spring break, or for summer break, I guess it is now. It just feels like spring. Earlier today, as we were driving to lunch, we drove past a car with an NWS sticker, and it was Doug's mom, and we waved to her, but she didn't see us. So hi, Bonnie. And then after we came back from lunch, Daniel commented on the fact that there were a tremendous amount of ice cream shops in town, and we weren't far from the Dairy Lodge, so we took him by there to see the Dairy Lodge. And there were a lot of students out in front celebrating their last day of school, and they were all asking the cars that went by to honk their horns, so we honked at them. So if you know of any of the kids that were out there celebrating today, you can let them know that that car, one of the cars that honked, contained an author who is currently #2 on the New York Times bestseller list. Now, this is not Daniel James Brown's first visit to the Grand Traverse area. Just this past October, he made an appearance at the Fountain Point Resort in Lake Leelanau, and he is back now by popular demand. His book, The Boys in the Boat, as I just mentioned, is currently #2 on the New York Times bestseller list. I could tell you a lot of other things about him, but I'm going to let you learn about all of that with the conversation between him and Lucas. So please join me in welcoming Lucas Whitman and Daniel James Brown to the National Writer Series stage.
Thank you, Joe.
Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Delighted to be here. I've learned my lesson, though. I'm going to go through Detroit from now on. I'm very excited to be here with Daniel James Brown. And it's an extraordinary book. I don't know how many of you have read it, but I hope you all will go and buy it after our conversation and read it. It's an extraordinary story about America in the midst of the Great Depression, and a story of 9 boys who did something extraordinary in overcoming the odds, taking on the entire country, and rowing their way to victory in Berlin at the 1936 Olympics, a very fraught and complicated Olympics, as we're going to talk about. And it was interesting. I was rereading the book a bit last week as we were celebrating and honoring the 70th anniversary of D-Day. And Daniel's book does such a wonderful job of bringing us back to that world, to that generation. And so I think it's particularly apt that we're talking about it here now. So Daniel, I'm an editor, so I always like to start at the beginning.
Sure.
So I wonder if you could tell us how you came to this story.
Actually, the story came to me, literally. It walked into my living room one day about 6 years ago. In my neighborhood, we have these horrible homeowners association meetings where we are compelled to get together and argue with each other over weighty issues like what color you may or may not paint your mailbox, and we get into just horrible things over this. And unfortunately, it was at my house 6 years ago. But actually, it turned out to be fortunate, because after that meeting, one of my neighbors, a lady I knew only as Judy at the time, came up to me, and she said she had been reading one of my previous books to her dad, and he was enjoying that. But he was in the last couple months of his life living under hospice care. And because he was enjoying the book, she asked if I would come down and meet him. And as she was going out the door, she mentioned something about rowing and an Olympic gold medal, but it just sort of went right over my head. So I think it was the next day, I went down to Judy's house, and I met this elderly gentleman named Joe Rance. And Joe was very weak. He was stretched out on a recliner. He was on oxygen, but he was very alert mentally. And we talked a little bit about that earlier book.
How old was he?
He was 93 or 94 at the time. we talked a little bit about that earlier book, and then he began to talk about his experience growing up during the Great Depression. And he had this particularly poignant story to tell about his family circumstances, and that actually wound up becoming a very important part of the book. But then he began to talk about how he came to row crew at the University of Washington starting in the fall of 1933, and how ultimately he and his crewmates had wound up rowing in Berlin for a gold medal, rowing against, amongst others, a German boat in front of Hitler and Goebbels and Goering and all the top Nazis. And, you know, as he told me this tale, I just became absolutely mesmerized by it. And I wound up that same day, I didn't go down there looking for a book topic at all, but I don't usually, you know, jump on a book topic that easily, but I was hooked right away. And so I asked him that day, I said, Joe, can I write a book about your life? And I really put it the wrong way, because he immediately shook his head and said, no, I don't want you to write a book about my life. And he thought about it for a minute, and he said, but you could write a book about the boat. And by the boat, of course, he meant himself and his crew members, and really more than just his crew members. He really meant this almost perfect thing that they had all become together, this beautiful thing that they had become together that afternoon in Berlin 75 years before. And so that really affected me, and that was the spirit in which I set out to write the book.
And who were these boys?
You know, these were kids that grew up in mill towns and on dairy farms around western Washington state. They were kids that grew strong with pitchforks and axes, and they were a pretty rough and tumble bunch of kids. Mm-hmm. Part of what's interesting about them is that to get where they wanted to go, they had to row against kids who were from entirely different kinds of life circumstances. The Ivy League kids from, you know, schools back east, and then beyond them they had to row against kids from Oxford and Cambridge, mm-hmm. kids who in some cases were literally aristocrats, and then ultimately this Nazi crew. So they were underdogs pretty much the whole way through this odyssey that they set out on.
And underdogs in a time when America was full of underdogs.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of the appeal of the story is that these were kids anybody could identify with, and Americans did identify with them because they were, for lack of a better term, they were blue-collar kids. And in those hard times, it was easy to feel that you had a kinship with them and to invest yourself in their endeavors and their exploits. So they were an appealing bunch of kids.
I think one of the more moving parts is that at a time now when the U.S. Olympic, as we saw recently, there's a lot of money that goes into the Olympics, and literally these boys had to kind of scrimp and save and raise money.
Yeah.
To pay for their way to the Olympics.
Yeah, part of what an interesting stop along the journey of this on their way to Berlin was that when the day that they won the right to become Team USA and go to Berlin and row, a couple hours after they won that right in a race, a gentleman named Henry Penn Burke from the Pennsylvania Athletic Club came to them, and he said, congratulations, but I hope you know your boys need to pay their own way. And none of these boys had 2 nickels to rub together, and the school didn't have any money to send them to Berlin, and nobody had told them that they would have to fund their own way. So this was a terrible blow. And then Burke went on to say, and Penn came in second, and actually we've got plenty of money, and so it's not a problem, we'll just go in your place. And so that night, Coach Ulbrichtson, the Washington coach, and the press contingent that was traveling with these kids from Washington, they got on the phones, and phones started ringing back in Seattle that night, and they rang deep into the night. And by the next morning, there were organizing committees, and by that afternoon, there were hundreds of Seattleites out on the street corner selling these little paper badges for 50 cents apiece. And within 48 hours, they raised $5,000, which in the midst of the Depression was an enormous amount of money. And they wired it east, and these guys were good to go to Berlin. But It's really only because the people of Seattle,
Gathered around them.
yeah, exactly.
Well, tell us a little bit more about Joe Rance, because he is the central character in the book. And he's that kind of character that, as a writer, you must have sort of come home after you first met him and think, oh my God, what have I got here?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, the moment I met Joe, I felt enormous empathy for him, for one thing. Partly just for a very personal reason. My own father died in the fall of my father's father died in the fall of 1929, the same month that Joe's family abandoned him. And so my own father's family situation deteriorated right at the beginning of the Depression. So as Joe was telling me that part of his story, I felt an immediate personal connection. But as I got to know Joe better over the next few months, next 2 months, he turned out to be one of the kindest and most generous people I have ever met. He was extraordinary. He was so positive in the way he looked at the world. He had all these very difficult circumstances to overcome in his childhood, and yet he remained extremely optimistic and positive through the whole story, and then into old age. He was just a very forward-looking man, and that made a big impression on me. I mean, became a huge admirer of his.
Yeah, I think there's maybe some lessons for us all there. I mean, he had a kind of, maybe a wicked stepmother might be too strong, but
well, pretty close to
pretty
it,
wicked. And his father was kind of weak and gave in to his stepmother. So paint us a little picture of what that family life was like, 'cause it was pretty terrible.
It really was. I mean, I think, as you say, very close to the wicked stepmother. I really didn't want it to be that way because it's a kind of a cliche, but there she was. It was a situation.
We can feel you resisting that as you write.
Joe. First of all, Joe's own mother died when he was 3 or 4 years old, and just old enough to sort of feel that loss deeply. And then when his father remarried, he remarried this young, very attractive woman named Thula. And it went okay for a while, but as their circumstances got harder, and they wound up living in a mining camp out in Idaho, Thula gradually came to resent Joe and to try to exclude him from the family, and literally shutting him out of the house, and ultimately leading his own father to abandon him. And people ask me all the time, well, what was, how do you explain that? How do you explain her motives? And I'm not sure I can. I think part of what was going on was that Joe was a reminder of that earlier marriage, and there was also a piano left over from the earlier marriage that Thula really wanted to get rid of.
And it's the only thing that the father saved from a fire.
Yes, yeah. When the house in Spokane burned down, he pushed this baby grand piano out of the house himself. And it was because it was, it's significant to him because it had belonged to his first wife. And Thula was really bothered by those kinds of things. And I think other than the piano, Joe was the other thing that really was an obvious reminder of that. So that's my own psychoanalysis of what Thula was doing, and it may or may not be accurate. What's hard for me to understand is Joe's own father and how he could let his second wife get between him and his son. Because, when you knew Joe, when you met Joe and you got to know him as a person, it's just almost impossible to see how anybody could harbor a grudge against him. He was such a remarkable man.
Yeah. He was. I mean, it's incredible that you sort of go through what he had to overcome just to even walk through the doors, through the gates of the University of Washington.
Yeah. The University of Washington was his sort of passport to a better life, as it was for a number of young people during the Depression. He really wanted to get a college degree, specifically an engineering degree, so that he could marry Joyce, his long-term girlfriend. And the only way he could afford to go to the university was if he got on the crew, because as long as he was on the crew, they would guarantee him a part-time job somewhere on campus. And that was what he was living off of. So he had to get on the crew, and then he had to stay on the crew. And it was very hard. There were hundreds of kids competing for places in just a few boats. So the psychological pressure on Joe was enormous through this whole period, just trying to stay on that crew so that he could stay at the university.
Yeah. And one thing that struck me was how different in a way college sports was then too, in that it was a sort of, they were all amateurs. None of the, I don't think any of the boys at the University of Washington crew had ever rowed before, really, or
no.
Maybe sort of with a rowboat or something, but they hadn't crewed before.
Exactly.
And there was no sports scholarships or anything like that?
There were no, at least for rowing, there were no scholarships, no.
Right.
The best they could do was a part-time job. And even, Joe and all these other kids, they worked hard during the summers to save up enough money to at least partially get them through another school year. Right. But we forget how incredibly tough it was to get any kind of job in the Depression.
Yeah.
And actually, Joe wound up working on the Grand Coulee Dam out in eastern Washington.
Right. Hanging
by ropes from a cliff, on a cliff face, with a jackhammer in his hands, pounding away at the rock face of this cliff day after day. And I forget what the wages they paid him were, but it was
75 cents an hour?
Something like that, yeah. And
I don't know what that is in today's money, but it's not a lot.
Not a whole lot, no. And it's really, it's very hot out there. It's a tough environment. Just being out there is tough. So that's the kind of thing they had to do in order to get a little money together and try to get through another year at school.
Right. And meanwhile, all the boys on the East Coast at Cornell and Harvard and Yale, they were all coming from prep schools where they had rowed, and they were kind of...
Yeah, these Washington kids, when they showed up at the Shell House, they didn't know one end of an oar from another, basically. And the kids that they would ultimately have to row against and defeat, as you say, many of them learned to row in prep schools, the more elite prep schools in the East. And they were also kids who had in many cases, enormous financial resources. So they weren't having to work, on the Grand Coulee Dam during the summer and scrubbing out locker rooms during the school year. So there was an enormous disparity in their economic circumstances.
And do you think that helped make them as a team, as a crew?
I do, actually. Without getting carried away with it, these kids from Washington, as I say, for the most part, they grew up on farms or in mill towns, so they were used to working with their hands. They were used to working outdoors. And then when they began to row, kids in the East, in the winter, they can't row on the rivers in the East because they freeze up. And so they row in tanks during the winter, indoors. The kids out in Washington State could row all winter, but they had to row out on Lake Washington. And believe me, I've been out there. It's windy and cold and sleety and nasty out on Lake Washington in February. But these kids rowed all winter long. And so I think these kinds of experiences, when it came time, for instance, for that gold medal race in Berlin, they were used to rough conditions. They were used to hardship, and I do think it gave them an advantage.
And I guess also the other thing I was thinking, that they also, as it were, came together and learned to row together, whereas the others maybe learned to row different styles or in different boats or with different crew members, and they were all kind of forged together rather than kind of separately. Yeah,
this crew came together over the period of 3 years, basically, and it's a very important distinction, being a crew as opposed to being 8 men or 8 women in a boat. Part of the interest of rowing for me was, and I didn't know any of this when I started the project, a rowing coach, Bob Ernst, the director of rowing at Washington, told me he would never just take the strongest man or the strongest woman in his boat and clone that man or woman and have 8 identical, very strong rowers. Rowing is a little bit mysterious. Putting a crew together is a little bit mysterious. There's a kind of alchemy to it, and it involves mixing and matching different physical types in different positions in the boat, and also different personality types. And so there was this, part of the intrigue of the story of this crew is that they didn't really come together until In the spring of 1936, there came a day when Coach Al Ulbrichtson, he'd been trying to get this perfect boat to go to Berlin, the best boat he could put together, and he had a boat that was the leading contender, but it just wasn't turning in the kinds of times he knew he would need. And there came a day when he put Joe Rance in at number 7. And Ulbrichtson's logbooks are actually kept in the Special Collections Archives at the University of Washington. And so I looked through those. The day they dropped Joe Rance into the number 7 seat in that boat, it took off with extraordinarily improved times. And basically, from then on, every time they went out, it got better and better and better. And it wasn't that Joe was such an extraordinary oarsman, it's just that he was the right oarsman. He was the other kids in the boat trusted him, they understood him, they knew him, they wanted him to succeed. There's a lot of emotional components. You need to care about the other people in the boat. You need to row for more than just yourself.
Just to be clear, Jordan, he had been rowing with some of these other boys for 3 years? Probably
Yeah, in different
2.5 years.
in different configurations in different boats. And also, 2 of them had worked with him out at the Grand Coulee Dam. And he'd had this very intense bonding experience doing all this hard physical labor out on the Grand Coulee.
Right. And you introduced Ulbrichtson there. He was the head coach at the University of Washington. Tell us a little bit about him, and also there's a kind of great, alongside Joe, who's the sort of the hero, and the boys are the heroes, there's this kind of great cast of characters around them who, as I'm sure as you were researching, you must have come across each one and learned about them and said, oh, yes.
Yes. You never know. When I started this project, I wasn't sure. I knew Joe was really interesting and a really great guy. But I was a little nervous at first because I didn't know the other 8 guys in the boat might have turned out to be complete jerks. Fortunately, and I can say this very sincerely, they all turned out to just be a really interesting and really wonderful assortment of young men. So I needed to go through a process of getting to know each of them, mostly through their family members. Their families have been sitting on this story for 70-some years now, hoping it would be told. And when they found out through Judy what I was doing, they began to come to me with boxes of letters and news clippings. And they sat down with me for hundreds of hours of interviews. And so I was able to develop each of those.
So these were sons and daughters and grandchildren of?
Sons and daughters, and sons and grandsons of the people I was talking about.
All the men in the boat?
Yeah, and granddaughters, yes.
Yeah.
So it really was a sort of collective effort in that sense.
It's wonderful, yeah, and it has a kind of immediacy to it in the writing, that you feel that you're there in the boat with them, and that you're kind of in the mind of at least some of them who I guess there were some diaries.
There were diaries. I had a lot of first-hand accounts. I was able to get into Joe's mind much more than the others because Judy had actually, before I even came along, Joe's daughter Judy had been following her dad around for 6 or 7 years, actually, with a notepad, prompting him and recording every little detail of this whole saga. And so when we sat down with Joe the last couple of months he was alive, we knew where to probe and where to look for still more detail because of all the research Judy had done before I even began. And then after Joe passed away, we still had all this voluminous amount of material. So
it's like a family stud circle.
Yeah, exactly.
I like that. So then tell us a little bit about the 2 men who, I think obviously in every great athlete's life there's a great coach or several coaches. And for these 9 boys, there were 2 seminal men who really helped shape them and give them the training and the kind of minds to go the whole way.
Yeah, and there were 2, and they were so different. I can't think of 2 more different men in some ways. First, Coach Al Ulbrichtson. Ulbrichtson was a pretty tough guy. He was very strict. He was very reticent. He did not like to betray emotion, particularly in front of his boys and in front of sports writers. He was often called the dour Dane or the man with the stone face. And he was very intimidating. But what he was good at was that alchemy I was talking about a minute ago, that mixing and matching, trying to find the right combination. He was also a big part of the drive between their ultimate success here. He was obsessed, it was sort of a personal obsession, with going all the way to Berlin and winning that gold medal, partly because his arch rival, the coach at Cal Berkeley, Kai Ebright, had twice before won Olympic gold, and Ulbrichtsen was just determined that in 1936 he was going to go rather than Ebright. So there was a kind of a personal thing going on there. But Ulbrichtsen was very stern, very quiet. But the other huge influence on all of them was this very interesting character named George Yeoman Pocock. Pocock was a British-born boat builder. He actually grew up in the boathouse at Eton College, apprenticed to his father building racing shells for the boys that rowed for Eton. And eventually he emigrated to Canada and then wound up at the University of Washington building these exquisitely beautiful Western red cedar shells that by the mid-1930s, every collegiate program in the country was rowing in these beautiful Pocock shells.
And his shells, he made them for the entire country,
Yeah, he started by making, he originally made them for the West Coast cruise, and then very quickly they were so superior that every program in the country wanted a Pocock shell. Right. They were just beautiful. But the thing about Pocock is he was so much more than a boat builder. He was really a kind of a sage. It's interesting, he only had a middle school education, but he was deeply read in Shakespeare and Milton and all sorts of classics. And he was also a very spiritual man. And he believed that there was a spiritual sort of component to rowing. And he taught these boys to row to win, certainly. And he was a very good oarsman. He taught them to row to win, but to row for something more than that. He taught them to join the crew and to row to become part of something larger and more important than themselves. In fact, he once said, when you're rowing perfectly, you'll feel as if you've rowed off the water and are rowing amongst the stars. So he saw it as a way for these young men to elevate themselves, particularly in these hard times. And he had a tremendous impact on many of them. I think particularly on Joe, because Joe was very troubled by his past. Joe had a very difficult time trusting other people because of the way he had been treated by his family. And yet crew is a sport that's all about trust. And so Pocock was the one that was able to take Joe aside and talk to him and begin to center him and begin to get him to let himself open up to the other boys and begin to trust them. And it made all the difference in the world for Joe Rance.
What does it take? I mean, I don't know if there are a lot of rowing crew fans in the audience here, but I certainly had watched a few races but didn't know anything about it really prior to reading this book. And I was struck by, and I don't know, did you know much about rowing?
No, I knew nothing about rowing, nothing at all. I'll tell you, and I worried about it a lot. The day after I met Joe and I really wanted to write this book and I was telling my wife about it, I came to a moment where I had to sort of panic because I realized, how are you going to write about a sport that you don't do? And so actually, a few weeks later, I went down to the Washington Shell House and the freshman coach, Luke McGee, took me out in the launch. I had the opportunity to get in a boat and row, but first they took me out in the launch with the freshmen. We went out on Lake Washington, and it was a typical gray, blustery, miserable day out on Lake Washington. And I was in the coach's launch, all huddled up, trying to survive. And this boat full of these 20-year-old kids, they stripped off their shirts, and they're these big, brawny 20-year-old kids. And they're out there, and they're rowing sprints back and forth for 2 hours. And I'm thinking how much I'm suffering sitting in the launch. Then we go back in, and they get out of the shell, and they march up, and they sit down at these erg machines and start pulling on these erg machines. And I thought, I am not getting in a boat with these guys. There is no way I get in a boat with these guys. So, but what I did, the people at the Washington Shell House and a lot of other rowers got very interested in what I was doing. And they gave me an enormous amount of help learning the mechanics of the sport, learning about the experience, different kinds of experiences, rowing in a high-stakes race, rowing in rough weather, and so on. And they wound up reading drafts of the manuscript. And so, again, it was sort of collaborative in that sense. I got a lot of help from a lot of very good rowers. And we really tried to vet it very carefully to make sure it was not only technically correct, but also accurate in terms of the experiential part of it.
Good. So now I can trust what I've learned then.
I think you can, yes. Somebody may disagree, but I...
What makes a good member of a crew? And what makes a good crew? I mean, that's sort of the question, the overarching question of the whole book in a way.
Yeah, it is. And there's kind of, I think the answer to that is a paradox. Somebody said, I think it was a rowing coach, said a crew member has to have a big ego and a little ego at the same time. And what he meant was that it's a pretty audacious thing to want to become an Olympic rower. You have to have a lot of self-confidence and belief in yourself to go out there day after day, you know, in the very painful conditions and keep doing it. You got to be a true believer, and you got to think pretty highly of your abilities. But, as I said earlier, crew is all about melding in with others and becoming part of something larger than yourself. And that requires that you subsume your ego. And so you have to have these very interesting kinds of personalities that are capable of both, of having a large ego and yet being able at the appropriate moments to subsume that ego into the needs of this larger thing that is the crew.
It's probably a good lesson for all of us in there, right?
I suspect that's a good life lesson for pretty much any kind of endeavor, yeah.
And particularly interesting, I think, with the backdrop of the Depression, when people were learning how hard it was to go it alone.
Yep.
And then when America was radically changing its entire philosophy about sort of helping others and the government being involved and all that. So it was an interesting kind of, through this one boat, you can kind of understand a little bit about a much deeper question.
You know, for me, absolutely. For me, this book, when I was finished with the book, I wasn't thinking in these terms when I was writing it at all, but after I finished the book, it was off to the printer. And I was thinking about, okay, what does this mean to me? Because I knew I would be out talking about it. And it came to me as sort of a flash that I think this story of these 9 young Americans who climbed in this boat and learned to pull together so beautifully and so powerfully is an almost perfect metaphor for what that whole generation of Americans did. You know, the generation we call the greatest generation. Rowing humbles one. It teaches you humility. And I think the Depression taught humility to a whole generation of Americans. And I think that humility is, in both cases, what allowed them to sort of open themselves up to others and become part of something larger and form these great teams. So as I say, for me, I think it's a pretty good metaphor for how that generation learned to pull together and get, you know, great things done, build the Grand Coulee Dam, survive the Depression, win World War II on 2 fronts, go on and build the most prosperous era in our history. I'm a huge admirer of that generation. And so for me, this story sort of encapsulates their whole experience in some ways.
And do it all with a lot of, at least from these boys, and I think for the whole generation, a lot of kind of humility and also a kind of just kind of can-doism. There isn't a lot of fluff and kind of talking themselves up. They just kind of went out and
absolutely. Yeah, you're absolutely right. There was absolutely a can-do kind of attitude that I remember from my parents and my uncles and my aunts. And I mean, it's not entirely dead today, but I associate it with that generation. I think they were very deeply imbued in that. And I think maybe that's because that's the way you got through the Depression and how you got through that awful war. You didn't have any choice. You just had to go do it.
I think of my 90-year-old grandfather with his duct tape trying to fix everything.
Exactly. I had uncles and like that. That's exactly right.
So we would be remiss if we didn't talk a little bit about what was happening in Germany too. And you have this kind of parallel in the book. You kind of take a pause from learning about Joe and the training and the competitions to kind of take us to Germany. And over the course of these 3 years, as these boys are learning how to row, Germany is falling under the ever greater control of Hitler and the Nazi Party.
Yeah, I became almost obsessed. I mean, I always knew, I think most people know, that the 1936 Olympics were used as a propaganda tool by the Nazis. But I didn't realize the extent to which that had begun as early as 1933, 1934. I wanted readers to see what was happening behind the scenes in Germany during those years, because the show they put on, the Germans put on at the Olympics, wasn't representative of what was happening behind the scenes in Germany. So I wanted to take readers and drop them down in Germany periodically, and give them telling glimpses of the kinds of things that were happening there. Partly because I wanted the readers at the end of the book, when they come to this big climactic gold medal race, it's largely between a German boat and an American boat in front of Hitler, I thought it was important that readers see what was at stake symbolically here. I mean, it's just a boat race on one level, okay? But symbolically, you have these two entirely different views of the world and even of civilization at stake in that race. And so I thought it was important to remind people what was going on in Germany.
And what exactly did the Nazis do to sort of hide and change the? I mean, so give us a sense of what it was like before all the competitors arrived at the Olympics, and then kind of what it was like during the Olympics. Because I think it's a very striking difference.
Yeah, you know, they basically these hundreds of thousands of foreigners, many of them Americans and Western Europeans, were converging on one place, which is Berlin. So they focused on Berlin. And they literally got down on their hands and knees and scrubbed the streets of Berlin. But more ominously, they rounded up and carried away the entire gypsy population of Berlin, any kind of mentally defective people, homeless people. And those people all disappeared into camps. This is well before the Holocaust. Those people disappeared into camps from which they never did return. They basically turned Berlin into a movie set, a sort of fantasy version of Germany. They whitewashed decrepit old buildings. They put pots of geraniums in front of abandoned apartments to make them look occupied. They draped the Nazi flags everywhere. It was just this, it was as if you were decorating a set. Because in large part it was. Leni Riefenstahl, the great German filmmaker, who was a very interesting character in and herself, was going to did document not only the games but also life in Berlin during those years. And so her cameras were everywhere in Berlin and at all the venues for the Olympics. And it turned into a large movie shoot on one level.
Right, and even further, they took down signs about forbidding Jews to go here and there, and all.
Yeah, there were signs forbidding Jews to go here and there. There were signs encouraging Jews to speed up around dangerous curves on the roadways. There were, just extraordinarily offensive things going on, and all that disappeared for the few weeks that summer that these hundreds of thousands of foreigners were in town.
Now, were Americans aware of all this? I mean, I know that's one of those great debates about the Holocaust and about the Second World War, is when did we know and how much did we all know? But it seems that basically they were hoodwinked about what was happening.
Most Americans...
Or allowed themselves to be.
Yeah, or allowed themselves to be, exactly. And a couple of things. Most Americans who went to Berlin that summer came back feeling very good about Germany, with very positive reports about Germany, because what they saw wasn't really what was happening in Germany. However, it is also, and actually a poll at the University of Washington that summer, 99% of the students said they didn't want any kind of foreign involvement in whatever happened in Germany. So there was a very great willingness to not see what was happening, and then the Germans aided that by creating this fantasy version. But you have to remember that there were, in fact, hundreds of thousands of Americans in the Jewish community, particularly in New York, who had relatives in Europe They were hearing what was beginning to happen. Now, the Holocaust hadn't happened yet, but very ominous things were happening. So the Jewish community in America was very alarmed by 1936, extremely alarmed, and as you may know, tried to organize a boycott of the games, and that got knocked down, basically.
Yeah, because the Olympic Games are meant to be, as we all know, it's a fraught, corrupt process, but meant to be this kind of great spirit of inclusiveness and nations competing at the highest levels and bringing peace and all that. And so it seems totally at odds that they would have a country that was rounding up people, that they'd have the Olympics there.
Absolutely.
And yet, so why'd the boycott fail?
The boycott failed largely, in my opinion, through the offices of Avery Brundage, who was the chairman of the International Olympic Committee. Brundage was, I think it's pretty clear now in retrospect, that he was an anti-Semite. And he used his powers to suppress the boycott movement and succeeded in it. It was just pretty much brutal power politics within the Olympic Committee.
And did the boys have any sense, the crew have any sense of what was going on, or what it meant to be there? Or?
You know, I think they had a general sense that Hitler was some kind of a weird dictator. I mean, you know, there was a sense that Hitler was bad, but nobody really knew, you know, how bad yet. And so when the boys went, they largely had the same impression that other Americans did. They came back thinking, well, Germany seems like a pretty reasonable place. Now, within a few years, every one of them had changed their mind about that, of course, when the reality began to become visible.
And when they all went off to serve in various ways.
Yeah, exactly.
And did you get any sense retrospectively? I mean, when you're talking to Joe, did he kind of realize just how incredible it had been to be rowing in front of Hitler and taking on the kind of...
Yeah, I think so. I mean, you know, within a few years, they could see the horror unfolding, and they realized they had been in Hitler's presence. It's actually kind of a cute little anecdote. When Hitler entered for the opening ceremonies, Hitler came marching through a corridor of troops into the stadium, and very impressive sight. But the athletes were arrayed outside the stadium on lawns. And most of the athletes from different countries around the world were standing at attention as Hitler came in. The American kids were lying on the lawn, and they sort of waved at him as he went by. The American boys also had another joke. They thought the Heil Hitler thing was pretty funny. So when they walk around Berlin, people would do this Heil Hitler thing to them, and they learned to respond by saying, well, Heil Roosevelt.
Speaking of Roosevelt, there's this wonderful scene which to me captured something that would certainly not be possible today, involving Roosevelt's youngest son. Roosevelt himself was a big fan of crewing. I don't know if you want to tell us that story.
Two of his sons rowed, and he was a huge fan of crew. But just before the big regatta in Poughkeepsie in 1936, the big de facto national championship, the boys had an evening off, and the coach let them borrow the coaching launch. And so they were trying to figure out what to do with their evening, and they decided, they knew Hyde Park, the Roosevelt's summer residence, was just up the river. So they decided they were going to go visit the president. And they did, or they tried. They took the launch, they went up the river to Hyde Park, they got off, they didn't know exactly where the house was, so they wandered around in the woods, and finally a gardener pointed out the house to them. They marched up to the front door and knocked on the door, and one of Roosevelt's sons answered, and the president was in D.C. that day. But the son let them in and sat them down in the parlor of Hyde Park, and he was a rower too, so they had a good long chat about rowing, and then they went home. But the audacity of marching up to the president's door and knocking on it.
Now you'd get shot. You know?
Yeah, exactly.
Tell us, I mean, just to go back a little bit. How good were they? I mean, especially reading your book, it's clear they were better than anyone else in the country. But looking back, and maybe you should tell people a little bit about sort of how they set the records they set and all of that. 'Cause I think it's important to get some context.
In Berlin in 1936, they had to. The crew they feared the most in terms of competition was the British crew, boys from Oxford and Cambridge rowing for the Leander Club. They were supposed to be the best crew in the world.
Which, just for those pop culture people out there, I don't know if you're any fans of House with Hugh Laurie.
Yeah.
His father was in that boat.
Yes, right.
For England. He was the stroke.
Yeah, Ran Laurie was the stroke for this British boat. And he was probably the greatest stroke oar of his generation in Britain. Very good boat. So to get to the gold medal round, the Americans had to row against the British in the preliminary round. And they beat the British in that race, but they set both an Olympic and a world record to do it. And it was an extraordinary race, extraordinarily close. It had the British, I think, unfortunately, it was such a hard road race that from the British point of view, they never really recovered from it because they had to come back, I don't remember if it was 1 day or 2 days later and row in the gold medal race. And the British couldn't get the energy back up again and didn't do very well in the gold medal race. But they were extraordinarily fast. Now, I have to say that I think they were arguably, certainly I could say the best collegiate crew of all time, but you could get very, down in the weeds about that. Certainly one of the top few collegiate crews of all time. I also have to say that crews these days turn in much faster times. That's because the athletes now are much bigger and bulkier than they were in the 1930s. If you look at pictures of these kids from Washington, you can see their ribs. They're just tall bean poles. The kids that row nowadays are big, bulky. Both the men and the women are very...
they have nutritionists and
exactly. They
lots
have
of sort of staff telling them what to eat, how to work out.
Exactly, and erg machines. It's all very scientific. So the rowers are bigger and brawnier now. And just as importantly, the boats are much lighter now. These guys were rowing in these beautiful but relatively heavy cedar shells. And nowadays they row in these very light carbon fiber shells. So they turn in much faster times now.
Right. I wanted to return, we had discussed a little earlier, but it's something that I think that we've maybe lost a little bit of here. But I realize I'm getting dangerous territory here, talking about college sports and in Michigan country here. But I did want to, because I did think there was something, and you see this when you're talking about any number of college sports from this generation, which is that there was less of this kind of, there was no real kind of corporate involvement. It was kind of boys going out there and trying their best and learning and becoming a kind of team or a crew together. And I think it was an interesting thing that I think we've lost some of that here in a way.
Yeah, I mean, these guys were, several things. Like even now, the University of Washington, they recruit rowers from Romania and New Zealand and all over the place. These were, as I said, largely farm kids from Western Washington that walked onto the crew, first of all. But there was also, they were amateurs in the deepest sense of the word. I mean, there was no financial glory or gain at all in this, except keeping a job at the University of Washington so you could go to school. And when you compare it to both college athletics and professional athletics now, it's an entirely different world. Nobody was promoting this crew on television or anywhere else. There was radio coverage of it, and the radio coverage was tuned into by millions of people. But that was just generated by the popularity of the sport itself. So there was very little in the way of institutional support. Mm-hmm. And in fact, after the Olympics, these 9 guys, Wheaties, whoever makes Wheaties, General Mills, I suppose, wanted them to put their image on the Wheaties box. And we're going to pay them, I don't know, whatever it was. And they turned it, all 9 of them said no, they didn't want any part of that.
Wow.
As I say, during times when a little bit of money would have gone a long way.
A long way. In terms of the popularity of the sport, I was really surprised at just how popular crew was then. I mean, you had, at the Poughkeepsie Regattas, you had tens of thousands of people turning up, even just to watch Washington row.
Yeah.
And the numbers are just, I mean, they're equivalent to college football games today in terms of people actually showing up.
Yeah, and it wasn't just Poughkeepsie. At regattas, various places in the country, 70, 80, 90,000 people would turn out. Out on Lake Washington in Seattle on a Saturday afternoon, you get 70, 80,000 people out for a regatta. People would fill the ferry boats. They'd line ferry boats up and other small vessels along the race course. They'd have an observation train running parallel to the race course, both in Poughkeepsie and in Seattle. Huge crowds, and that would be a Saturday afternoon would be to go to see the crew races.
So what happened?
Well, a couple things. I mean, or actually one big thing, I think. You know, we have 80 channels or whatever it is now of sports to watch, and we have big business, as you were just saying. We have the NFL and the NBA and these huge institutions promoting their sports, and there's just too much competition for the eyeballs. The other thing I have to say is that watching a crew race from the shore is sometimes very exciting, but it's not always very exciting. There are times, if you watch the boats and they come down, they go by, and you may or may not know who won the race, and it's a little hard to get whooped up about it. But what I would say about that is that, and one of the things I tried to do in the book is to see it from the athlete's point of view. So much of the drama in the crew race takes place between the gunwales of the boat. So much of it takes place in the boat. That one of the things I really wanted to do with the book was drop you down in one of those seats and make you experience one of these races from that viewpoint. Because there was a lot of drama seen from the boat.
Talk us through a little bit of the process of how because you do get us into the boat, and I was very impressed by that, and I think people will be, how'd you get in there? I mean, you talked to them, but you sat in the boat yourself, you rowed?
Just enough to feel what it feels like, yeah.
The pain and...
Not enough of the pain to feel it, but boy, I heard a lot about pain, believe me. You have to remember that because the sport was so popular in those days, that there was a huge amount of press coverage of it. For any one of these races, I could find dozens of very long articles detailing all the events leading up to the race and then exactly what was going on in each boat during the race. And then, of course, having the diaries of some of these guys also, they were able to give firsthand accounts of what they were thinking and what they were feeling at different moments in the race. So there just was a lot of firsthand and secondhand observation of what was happening that I could draw on.
And there's a remarkable stat that you have in the book, which is that, I believe this is just for the final racing season for the boys, but they had rowed 4,344 miles.
I think that's right, yeah.
Which is sort of like Seattle to Tokyo, basically.
Well, yeah, just about.
More or less. They'd each given around 469,000 strokes,
yep,
give or take. And that was all just for 28 miles of actual competitive racing.
Yeah, I mean, one of the interesting things about crew then and now, for these guys, there were only 3 or 4 major races in a year, which meant that every race was very, very high stakes. So they would practice for endless hours out on Lake Washington for just a few minutes of actual racing time. And as I say, that's part of what ratcheted the drama up, was that they didn't have time to make mistakes or have a second try at it. It was all on the line every time they raced.
Right. And how did that make the boys feel? I mean, that kind of pressure, that competition.
I think it made them nervous, especially when they were freshmen, when they were first starting. You can see in the things they wrote about it that there was a lot of tension. I think, and there was all the way through, certainly before the gold medal race in Berlin, there was a lot of anxiety, particularly because the stroke oar was so ill and there were all kinds of things going wrong. But I do think they got more centered as they got older and got to be a better crew. And I think that I think they actually learned to sort of, and Pocock was a part of this, learned to center themselves and be much less anxious and just sort of assume that they were going to win these races. They tended, as a bunch of people, they tended to have very positive expectations of what was going to happen.
And did it have any rituals? I always like reading about athletes' rituals, what they do before a game.
Not that I'm aware of, no.
Okay. Another thing with these athletes is you always wonder what it was like afterwards. That you talk to Olympic athletes or read about them, and especially Olympic athletes, but also pro athletes. And that was, there are those moments, they're the high points of their life, and it can be very, very hard to kind of live a normal life and raise kids and all of that. And yet these 9 men seem to have done that with a certain amount of...
They did, with one exception. It was very interesting. Partly because 8 of them were very humble, and I'll talk about the 9th in a second. 8 of them were conspicuously humble. Those guys came home and they stuck their gold medals in sock drawers. And because it was a depression, they had to immediately go out and get a job to try to get through another year of school. And so they just went about their business. Some of them never bothered to tell their kids about the gold medal until much later in life. But the exception was Bobby Mock, the coxswain. And Bob, his daughter Marilyn told me while I was in the process of interviewing her about her father, she said that Bob never really got over it, in the sense that it was the most exciting, fulfilling thing he had ever done. And she said he spent the rest of his life trying to find something that would match it for sheer impact on him. And it was kind of a problem. I mean, Bob Mock was a pretty driven guy, and he wasn't a particularly humble guy. And
he went on to be a very successful lawyer.
Yes, he became a very successful lawyer, yes, in Seattle, and argued cases at the U.S. Supreme Court, in fact. So, but he was, according to Marilyn, his daughter, he was the only one of them that really actively tried to promote what had happened. For the rest of his life, he would tell anybody, and he'd try to get articles written, and he was constantly trying to keep the story alive. But as I say, it sort of took a toll on him because he never really found anything quite that intense again.
And arguably, he was the one who really made it happen. Yeah,
arguably he was. I mean, Bob Mock's one of the most interesting characters in the book, as far as I'm concerned.
I missed him.
So Bob Mock was, coxswains, of course, if you don't row or don't know rowing, coxswains are the relatively short person who sits in the back of the boat and steers it, and also gives commands, basically, to the rest of the crew. And Bob Mock was a very smart fellow, and he was not above both defying his coach and lying to his crew in order to make things come out the way he wanted. And there's a wonderful race in 1936 in Poughkeepsie in which he did both. Well, I won't tell you too much in case you haven't read it, but he outright defied Ulbrichtsen in terms of what he was supposed to be doing out on the river, and yet he made it work. So he was just, he was one of these characters that is just irresistible to a writer, I think. Tenacious. He was 5'7", which is how tall I am. And in high school, he went out for basketball, and he lettered in basketball. And I remember hiding from basketball all the way through school. Like, the last thing, just don't make me play basketball. But he was that kind. He was gonna, if there was something that was challenging, he was gonna try to do it.
And I wonder, we're just gonna wrap it up here, but a few more. One, I wonder what you learned writing this book. I mean, from guys like Bobby Mock, and from that kind of, what was the sort of, when you were done, what was the kind of feeling you were left with about these individuals and what they had done together?
Yeah, it turned out to be so much more than I thought. I mean, I sort of went into thinking it was a really cool sports story, and it turned into so much more than a sports story. I think the most important thing, actually I'll read here a passage in just a second that touches on this. the most important thing, I think, is what I said a little earlier, that about this generation and the extraordinary qualities that they developed. And I came away humbled myself by feeling somewhat inadequate in comparison to what these guys had done. I mean, my life's been happy and successful, and I'm not going to try to second guess that, but these guys are almost godlike to me when I sit back and I look at what they did and contemplate the circumstances in which they did it, the things they overcame in order to get where they were trying to go. So I found it very humbling, and just I admire them enormously.
That's great. Well, I think you shouldn't undersell your own achievements. As a book publisher, I have the access to a certain magical database that tells me how many books get sold in this country. So when I looked up Daniel's sales, and they are very, very impressive, over 200,000 copies in the hardcover alone, and the paperback's just come out, which is a very rare thing to do in today's book selling environment, book buying environment. So I wonder also, obviously, you've struck a chord with this book, and I don't, as you've gone around the country, and you've been touring now off and on for a year and a half? Or?
Yeah, well, the book came out a year ago. So
a year ago.
Yeah.
What's been the reaction from readers?
It's just been overwhelmingly positive, you know, and it's taken several different forms. The first month or so the book was out, most of the feedback I was getting was from rowers or people who have kids that row or whatever, people associated with rowing. And so the initial reaction was just basically, thank God somebody finally wrote a book about our sport. We've been waiting and waiting. Nobody pays any attention to our sport. So there was an initial wave of that. But then the audience has broadened out as the book has gone out into the world, and it's much more diverse now, although rowers still seem to be reading it and enjoying it. But one response I get in emails almost every day is I get emails particularly from people of a certain age, and by a certain age I mean my age and older. I'm 62. People who say that, older people who say that they've just finished the book and they have tears in their eyes as they've finished it. And I just find that really interesting. I think it's taking people back to a time when things were working better in certain ways, and they feel a loss of something in our current times that ought to be there. So there's all that going on too.
Thank you. Well, with tears in our eyes, Daniel, would you like to read for us a little bit?
Yeah, I have one passage.
Thank you.
So
then it's time for all of you to ask some questions.
So while I was working on the book, towards near the end of the project, I wanted to go to Berlin. Actually, not to Berlin, but to Grunau, this little village south of Berlin on the Langer See, which is where the race course was. I wanted to see it if I was going to write about it, of course, and I hadn't been able to do that up to that point. So before I wrote the Berlin stuff and the gold medal race, I went to Germany and I went out to Grunau, and I had an opportunity to go up on the balcony where Hitler stood. And I just want to read you what went through my mind that day as I was there, because it sort of sums up what I was just saying about how I feel about this generation. I'll start here. In Grunau, I found the regatta grounds little changed from 1936. A large electronic reader board now dominates the area near the finish line, but otherwise the place looks much as it does in the old newsreels and photographs. The neighborhood is still lovely, green and leafy. The covered grandstands still rise near the finish line. The Langer See is still placid and tranquil. Earnest young men and women in racing shells still ply its waters in racing lanes laid down just as they were in 1936. I visited the Wassersports Museum in Grunau, where late in the afternoon, Werner Philipp, the director, kindly led me up a set of stairs to the balcony of Haus West. I stood there for a long time, a long quiet minute, near where Hitler stood 75 years before, gazing out over the Langer See, seeing it much as he saw it. Down below me, young men were unloading a shell from a truck, singing something softly in German, and preparing for an evening row. Out on the water, a single sculler, his blade glinting, worked his way down one of the lanes towards the large Yale sign at the end of the course. Closer to me, swallows flew low over the water on silent wings, silhouetted against the declining sun, touching the water from time to time, dimpling the silver surface. Standing there, watching them, it occurred to me that when Hitler watched Joe and the boys fight their way back from the rear of the field to sweep ahead of Italy and Germany 75 years ago, he saw but did not recognize the heralds of his doom. He could not have known that one day hundreds of thousands of boys just like them, boys who shared their essential natures, decent and unassuming, not privileged or favored by anything in particular, just loyal, committed, and perseverant, would return to Germany, dressed in olive drab, hunting him down. They are almost all gone now, the legions of young men who saved the world in the years just before I was born. But that afternoon, standing on the balcony of House West, I was swept with gratitude for their goodness and their grace, their humility and their honor, their simple civility, and all the things they taught us before they flitted across the evening water and finally vanished into the night. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. I've got tears in my eyes now. So, questions from all of you? Yes. There's some microphones here. If you just wait 1 second.
One question and one suggestion. Question, when did you figure out that Joe Rance had never lost a race, a competitive race? And second, I think it would be helpful to tell the audience, for people who don't know anything about rowing, that it's the most difficult sport there is, because 8 people have to do exactly the same thing
Right.
at exactly the same time forever and ever.
Yes, that's right. In my usual book talk, I go on quite a bit about that, actually. It's extraordinarily challenging for that very reason. I mean, aside from being physically difficult, the precision of the timing is just amazing. Somebody said once that if you putting 8 men or women in a shell and asking them to row an Olympic 2,000-meter race is like putting 8 men or women in front of 8 golf balls and asking them to swing with golf clubs and hit those balls at precisely the same moment, directing the ball in precisely the same direction with precisely the same amount of force, and then to do the same thing over and over every 2 seconds or so for the next 6 minutes. I mean, that's sort of the basic experience. I found out, actually, what was the question about Joe? I'm sorry.
Never lost a race.
Oh, I think I knew right from the beginning. I think Judy told me pretty early on that Joe was one of just a couple guys that actually never, in the overall crew, that actually never lost a race. They went on, by the way, the next year in 1937 and won the national championship again and remained undefeated.
Wondering, the coxswain Bobby, when he got the letter from his father telling him that he actually, his parents were Jewish and he never knew that. He was raised not Jewish, but when they left Germany, they hid it when they came to this country. Just wondering what else you knew about that, or what happened when he got to Germany.
Yeah, I wish I knew more. So Bob Mock didn't, when they were in New York getting ready to go to Berlin, Bob knew he had relatives in Germany and Switzerland, and so he wrote back to Seattle and asked his dad for the addresses of these relatives, and what came back was an envelope, and inside the envelope was another envelope that said, open this in a private place. So Bob went out in a field and sat under a tree and opened it up and learned for the first time in his life that his heritage was Jewish. And Marilyn, his daughter, said he burst into tears immediately upon reading that, not because he was upset at discovering that he was Jewish, but he was terribly pained by the fact that his father had felt it necessary to conceal that from him in America. You know, we forget how much anti-Semitism there was in this country in the 20s and the 30s and beyond, actually. So that really pained Bob. So when they got to Germany, I wish I knew more. I couldn't write about it because I don't know a lot more. After the games, a number of them, including Bobby Mock, took a bicycle tour through Germany and Switzerland and a little bit into Italy. Bob peeled off from that for a few days, presumably to visit his relatives. Presumably he did visit them, but I don't know any more than that about it, and I don't know what became of them.
Perhaps the most famous episode in the 36 Olympics is Jesse Owens' success as a sprinter. Was the crew aware of the drama surrounding his triumph in front of Hitler?
Yeah, they were at the Olympic Stadium the day before Jesse won those gold medals. They saw some of the preliminary heats. They weren't there the day of the gold medals, or the 2 days, whatever it was. So they found out about it the same way everybody else did, because it became a big press. The Jesse Owens story became a huge press story immediately, and it actually dominated the headlines in Europe and over here for quite a while. So they just found out the same way that everybody else did. They did meet Jesse on the boat. Some of them had some interactions with him. The interesting thing about the Jesse Owens story, I usually start my book talks by saying, I think the Jesse Owens story is rightly the greatest story out of the Berlin Olympics. It's one of those stories that we keep alive and we tell and retell. We put in to our children, we put in textbooks, because it's one of those stories that helps define who we are and what we value. But I also go on to say, I think this story of these 9 young Americans who climbed in a boat and learned to pull together so beautifully and become a great team is another of those stories that's worth telling and retelling. Jesse Owens' story was a story of great individual achievement. This story, I believe, is a great story of a great collective achievement, and it shows what we can do when we do pull together.
Hi. I can't wait to read your book. It kind of reminds me of Unbroken. It seems there are so many stories out of that era that it's an unbelievable period of time. Unbroken by Hildebrand?
Yes. I'll tell you a little story about that, actually, or about Laura. So the day after I met Joe Rance, I took an old paperback copy of Seabiscuit by Laura Hillenbrand, a book I admire very much. And actually, my wife and I were going to Hawaii for a vacation, so I took it on the plane. And I spent most of the time I was in Hawaii actually just annotating the heck out of this book. I wrote notes on every single page, trying to understand why she made the writerly decisions that she did, because I really wanted to write that kind of a book. And then when Unbroken came out, partway through while I was writing my book, somebody sent me an advance copy, and I did the same thing. I stopped working on my book, and I sat down and I studied Unbroken from cover to cover. And then what's really cool is that my book came out June a year ago, and about 2 months after that, I was on Facebook chatting with one of my daughters, and all of a sudden up pops this little window from Laura Hillenbrand saying, "Friend me?" And I said, "Yes, I will friend you, Laura Hillenbrand." So I friended her, of course. And then about 10 minutes later, up pops this message from her, and she had just finished reading The Boys in the Boat, and she loved it. She just went on and on about it. And of all the really cool things that have happened to me with this book, that's absolutely at the top. It's just like, yes.
I was wondering if you had the opportunity to interview any of the other rowers on the boat.
Yeah, when I started, only Joe and Roger Morris, the bowmen, were still alive, and I I interviewed Joe intensely. I interviewed Roger a couple times, but truth be told, his memory was very, very weak at that time. So mostly I had to depend on the close family members of the other 8 guys in the boat. But as I said, they were very, very forthcoming and very eager, and many of them had kept huge amounts of documentation on their dad's parts in this story. So it was very fortunate the way it worked out.
Two of the things that I thought were very interesting, if you just comment on, is what he did after he raced the Boeing experience. And then the strength that his wife, first girlfriend, then wife, was to him. I thought she was very important.
Yeah. Yeah, and he met her on the school bus when they were junior high school age kids. And Joe used to sit at the back of the bus. Joe loved to play banjo and guitar, and so he was in the habit of sitting at the back of the bus playing his instrument and singing these really corny songs that he liked. And one day this little petite blonde comes to the back of the bus and sits herself down next to him and starts singing along with him. And 70 years later, they're growing old together. It's really cool. She was a remarkable young woman. She was a country girl basically, and yet pretty atypically for the age. She went to the University of Washington, graduated Phi Beta Kappa, very smart woman, very accomplished in her own right. A really wonderful woman too.
Maybe just a little bit about Boeing as well. Joe went to work.
Oh yeah. So after graduating, a number of these guys were engineering majors, and so a number of them went to work for the Boeing Aircraft Company. In fact, during the war, several of them, I don't know this for sure, but I think they were diverted into the Boeing company because I think they were more valuable as engineers at Boeing than they would have been overseas. At any rate, Joe had a long, happy career at Boeing.
Oh, okay. Great. Other? Yes, up front here. We'll get 1 second, sir.
When the feature film comes out, who would you like to see play Joe? And who would play Mock?
I'm the world's worst person when it comes to movies and movie stars. I don't actually follow movies very much. So my wife has a long list of how thing should be cast.
But it has been sold, and there is a movie.
Yeah. So actually, the Weinstein Company, which is a company that made The King's Speech and a number of other Oscar-winning films, first optioned and then exercised that option and bought the film rights a couple of years ago. And for a while, they didn't seem to be doing much with it, but just actually in the last month or so, they've got a screenwriter on board, and they're talking about some directors, and they seem finally to be picking it up and moving forward with it. So I'm not terribly in the loop. They have reached out to me a little bit recently. I get the impression they're at least going to show me the script. Or wave it in front of me and say that I loved it. I don't know. I don't know.
Good. We had a gentleman in the front here.
By your own admission, you started from zero with regard to your understanding of understanding of rowing, and obviously became very accomplished in your knowledge. Do you find yourself drawn to sports issues as a result, even things that you don't know very much about, like bicycle racing or some other kind of racing or some other kind of sport?
I've always been a sort of a moderate sports fan. I mean, I have my baseball team and my football teams I follow in college and professional. So I'm a sort of average sort of sports fan. It has made me definitely a fan of crew. I actually go to crew races now because I see so much more that I didn't see before. And I'm always interested in learning about other sports and sports can be a great platform on which interesting human tales are told. And I think this book is an example of that. So yeah, I'm always interested in learning more about sports I don't know anything about.
Could you add anything more to what you said in the book to that last race and the things that the Germans did to adulterate the race, change it?
Yeah.
This is the Olympic race, the gold medal race in Berlin.
Yeah, so it was very strange. I think you're referring to the lane assignments. Yes. The Americans, as I said earlier, had to beat the British to qualify, and those two boats turned in the two fastest qualifying times in the preliminary rounds. The German and the Italian boat turned in relatively slow times. When the lane assignments were announced for the gold medal race, Germany and Italy were assigned lanes 1 and 2, which were sheltered from the wind all the way down the length of the race course. The Americans and the British were assigned lanes 5 and 6, where they had to row out into the widest, windiest part of the course. And so that 1,000 meters into the race, halfway through the race, the Americans were out in the middle of the longer sea with waves breaking over their bow and watching Bobby Mock, the coxswain, watching the German and Italian boats streak down lanes 1 and 2, sheltered from the wind. So it gave them a terrible disadvantage. Everybody knew ahead of time the race course was notorious for the fact that lanes 5 and 6 were a serious handicap. And so I tried to find, some smoking gun to explain how this happened. I couldn't find a document or anything that, said specifically the Nazis fooled with the lane assignments and influenced the Olympic Committee to make this really strange decision. So I just told it what I knew about it, that the Americans were assigned lanes 5 and 6, the Germans were assigned, and Italians were assigned lanes 1 and 2. And it's very, very fishy, basically.
We have time for one more question.
I think, yes, there, this gentleman here.
Actually, I was going to ask that same question about the lane placement, but the other thing that was pretty incredible about it wasn't, I played a lot of sports, but nothing that much in a lot of team sports, but nothing that created that synchronicity. You called it the swing.
Yeah.
It don't mean a thing unless you got that swing. And when you saw it happening, it must have been just a magical experience to create that kind of precision that they had to have.
Yeah, so rowers, when they talk about swing, as this point when you're rowing and everything finally works just perfectly, and even though you're rowing very hard, the rowing suddenly itself seems effortless, or nearly effortless. They speak about that in almost mystical terms. I mean, I've not experienced this, so I'm relying on what other people have told me. But I've been amazed, both while I was researching, writing the book, and then also in the last year, running around the country talking to so many rowers when they describe, this time that their boat really began to swing. Because as I say, they talk about it in almost mystical terms.
Well, with that, I think thank you all for joining us. Thank you, Daniel.
Thank you. Thank you.